Okay, hello everyone. So welcome again. Welcome back to the next session of the 2018 Scholar and Feminist Conference, Subverting Surveillance, Strategies to End State Violence. This conference is hosted and organized by the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And as we've been doing, we need to thank Professor Rebecca Jordan-Young and Avi Cummings and the staff of BCRW. It's a great honor to be here on this stage. So I teach in the American Studies program at Barnard, and with Christina Heatherton and Jordan Camp, I'm part of New Directions in American Studies, which is an intellectual formation that's thinking through the interrelated method and practice of anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and historical materialism. So this panel is being convened under the title, "In This Time of Siege of Me and Mine, Mi Raza, Normalizing the Insecurity, Security State, Border Enforcement." Our speakers are Rachel Ida Buff, Inderpal Grewal, Arun Kundnani, and Marlene Nava Ramos. So I'll read their bios and they'll speak in that order. Rachel Ida Buff teaches history and comparative ethnic studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she directs the Comparative Ethnic Studies in Cultures and Communities programs. Her most recent book is Against the Deportation Terror, Organizing for Immigrant Rights in the 20th Century, which is available through Temple University Press. Additionally, she writes frequently for a wide array of progressive media. She's the academic editor of the American Association of University Professors Journal of Academic Freedom and is completing a novel entitled Into Velvet. Inderpal Grewal is professor and chair in the program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. She's also professor in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration Studies program, the South Asian Studies Council, and affiliate faculty in the American Studies program. She's the author most recently of several books, a number of books, most recently Saving the Security State, Exceptional Citizens in 21st Century America, and that's available through Duke University Press. An advisor to the UK government has described Arun Kundnani as an imbecile who writes, quote, intellectually lazy, retarded, tribal anti-establishment nonsense. That's a close quote. Hey, you put it on the site. The Times columnist David Aaronovitch has called him an idiot. The Guardian has described him as one of Britain's best political writers. Kundnani is the author of two books, most recently, The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and The Domestic War on Terror, which is available through Verso. Born in London, he moved to New York in 2010 and now lives in Harlem. A former editor of the journal Race and Class, he's currently a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. And Marlene Nava Ramos is a PhD student in geography at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also an organizer and member with the New York City chapter of Critical Resistance and has been active in campaigns such as ICE Free NYC. Her research studies the political economy of immigrant enforcement practices in the states of Florida and New Jersey from 1980s to the present. Ramos has taught with the Bard Prison Initiative at the Fishkill Correctional Facility and at CUNY's Lehman College in the Bronx. And she's an alumna of Columbia University. All right, so the title of this panel is taken from a poem by Maria Melendez Kelson called Ice Agents Storm My Porch. And I felt like it was necessary for me to read the poem before we begin. So, the indiscriminate citizenry of Earth are out to arrest my sense of being a misfit. Open up, they bellow. Hands quiet before my door, that's only wind and juniper needles anyway. You can't do it, I squeak from inside. You can't make me feel at home here in this time of siege for me and mine, mi raza. Legalized suspicion of my legitimacy is now a permanent resident in my gut. Fruit of the prickly pear, they swear, striding up to my table to juice me a glass of pink nectar. They brought welcome baskets stuffed with proof I'm earthling. From under a gingham cover, I tug a dark feather, iridescent green, cohering to magpie thought, to memory's chatter, to mind, mine. And here they have my mind translated into a slate surface pond which vibrates in the shape of a cottonwood's autumn molt, which trees me to dirt, which soils me heat and freeze. But you'll always be one definitive document short, I complain. Doubts can forever outstrip your geologic, for which they produce a lock of my natal dust, bronze to the fluttering fiber of a lace-bark pine. Where'd they get that stuff? The baskets are bottomless, and it's useless for me to insist on being distinct. Undergoing reportation, I'm awakened to a center, where walls between all beings are dreamt to dissolve. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here on a Saturday. Let's try that again. I'm going with Christina's thing. Good morning. Good morning. I'm so honored to be here with such brilliant and principled and engaged people. I'm so grateful for the invitation. And I bring you greetings and salutations from occupied University of Wisconsin. And I want to tell you from the bottom of all that I am that I think it really matters the work that we do here, the work that's being done at BRCW, at New Directions in American Studies, that this is the work that is being undermined around the country, that is being purposefully, step by step, destroyed, and there's a reason for that work. And there's a reason for our gathering here. So this is an act of being here, is an act of solidarity and resistance against what is happening to all of our institutions. I won't go on, but I could. And I also want to say, thinking about surveillance, which I have to say I don't very much, so I appreciate the invitation to do so. I'm a historian of immigration and counterinsurgency and repression, and the invitation to come here has made me think more about surveillance and visuality. I should say I'm married to an art historian who laughs when I say I think about visuality, because I don't. But I just don't, I forget. While we're thinking about surveillance and what is seen, I think we need to think about its opposite, about what is hidden and what is obscured purposively. My book, which is for sale upstairs, Against the Deportation Terror, is a story about a history of immigrant rights organizing in the 20th century. And really, I can save you $24.95 and tell you there was a history of immigrant rights organizing in the 20th century, and no one knows it, and there's a reason for that. So the surveillance state watches us and then eviscerates our history and our traces. And I think that's really important. So when I heard Jordan talking about the Civil Rights Congress, I feel like these invocations are charged and holy moments. Often when I speak from my book about the organizers in there and I say the names, I have older people come up to me afterwards and thank me for saying the name because of what is erased, because of the tremendous force that is amassed to obscure the histories that we need. So that's a word about surveillance. So I kind of took this invitation as an invitation to really think about surveillance. And I had just finished teaching Simone Brown's wonderful book, Dark Matters, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from her later today. And I decided to think about the invitation to come here and the coincidence, which I had done intentionally, of teaching her book, as an invitation to try and think about the long fetch of repression and border enforcement as they relate to questions of slavery and freedom in United States history. And how what I'm working on now is trying to think about the question of itinerancy and vagrancy, displacement and dispossession, which seem intuitively like the opposite of detention and incarceration, but of course are not, right? As Mariam Kaba reminds us, and as Kelly Little Hernandez writes in her recently released book, City of Inmates, it is those most likely to live their lives in public who are the most vulnerable to detention and deportation and incarceration. So I started to look at Simone's book and try and see what it did to reframe questions of itinerancy and its consequences. And Simone lays out sort of 3 P words to look through: predicaments, policies, and performances. So, like Jordan, I went to the predicament outlined by William Paterson and the Civil Rights Congress in their petition of 1951, We Charge Genocide. And I have a quote from that that I think is very interesting and important, and Jordan read part of it, but I'm going to read the last part of it as well. The characteristic feature of life in the United States is the murderous brutality towards colored citizens in and out of the ghettos in which they are forced to live, the use of state troopers to suppress their democratic demonstrations, seeking enjoyment of their inalienable and constitutional rights. Coupled with this policy is the increasing use of Black nationals as armed gendarme to force America's murderous brand of democracy upon foreign peoples. Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia are proof of the last allegation. A false brand of criminality is constantly stamped on the brow of Black youth by the courts and systematically kept there, creating the fictions that Blacks are a criminally minded people. So Paterson in 1950 and the Civil Rights Congress are aware of this process of visibility and surveillance as a marking point, a branding point in African American history. And I think that that assertion in an international context of their petition is really important. Of course, the Civil Rights Congress included activists like Paul Robeson, pictured here, protesting in Washington in 1948. So that's the predicament outlined by the Civil Rights Congress in 1950. And the policy sort of put in force against organizations like the Civil Rights Congress, like the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, which my book is about, people organizing against this brand of racialized surveillance, detention, and deportation was the McCarran Internal Securities or Subversive Control Act of 1950, which Jordan touched on, but I want to kind of hover over the McCarran Act, and I want to start by asking you to think about the McCarran Act through the Fugitive Slave Act and up to the USA Patriot Act, as installing regimes of surveillance and visibility and presumptive guilt, right? So all three of these different moments install a notion that you can detain somebody for what you suspect they might do. I'm going to talk a little bit about histories of legislation and resistance to legislation involving the McCarran Act, but it's important that there are afterlives as well. So some battles that are fought and won or lost in the courts are also haunted. So this notion that, and this is very important in terms of stop and frisk policing, which we heard about, in terms of the kind of constant harassment, in terms of the kinds of deportation raids we've seen really for the last 7 years, but particularly for the last year since the inauguration. This notion of suspicion of possible guilt, which the McCarran Act instantiates. So it says that reasonable grounds of suspicion of sabotage are grounds for emergency detention, and it puts into effect something that is counterintuitive but worth meditating on, the idea of retroactive illegality. So if you were a member of the Communist Party in 1950, you could be charged with having been a member of the Communist Party in 1934, even though it wasn't illegal in 1934. So this messing with the space-time continuum, the McCarran Act did, very important in installing a practice of bending time and space to think about deporting and detaining people. Under the McCarran Act, Paul Robeson lost his passport, which he eventually got back. Claudia Jones, who Jordan talked about at length, Trinidadian American communist thinker, one of the inventors of which, theorists of what was called at the time the triple oppression, or what we call today intersectionality, and somebody who thought about internationalism, but also after her deportation under the McCarran Act to London, came to think about her itinerant status as another bolster of her identity. So the question of being precarious in a nation added to our notions of intersectionality. It's really important also that under the McCarran Act set up 6 detention sites, that some of which had been used during the Japanese-American internment. It set up these sites for the potential detention of radicals and other people charged. So the Japanese-American Citizens League was alerted to this, being rather sensitive about locations like Tule Lake and having a history with them, and began to lobby against federal appropriations for detention sites. And by 1957, the federal budget allocations for these detention sites ended. Many of them then became federal corrections institutions. So there's a pretty interesting progression there from incarceration site to detention camp to federal prison. I really liked so much of what was said before in the panel before, but I think what Ruth Gilmore said about we are all seen already together, right? The seeing eye of the state sees us as a collective project even when we don't necessarily see ourselves that way. And I think the opposite is also true, that we start to come into relationships of solidarity when we start to oppose these processes. So here's Charles R. Allen, who was editor of The Nation and an anti-Nazi and an anti-racist. He wrote a book called Concentration Camps USA in 1966, where he just said, hey, there are these places and they're still there, and the McCarran Act, the preventive detention, is still on the books. And that started to circulate this idea of concentration camps. If you know folks who were involved in freedom struggles in the 60s and 70s, it kind of circulated as kind of a rumor, a fear, but it was actually, those detention camps were actually still there. And so these rumors circulated and became part of movement culture in the 60s and 70s. They became part of Black Panther culture. They became part of what comes to be the Asian American Pacific struggle on the West Coast, as concentration camps in America set up to detain radicals, which is exactly what they were. So in 1968, the Asian American Political Alliance, in concert with the Oakland Black Panthers, started a campaign, and they allied with the Japanese American Citizens League, to get rid of the camps, to get rid of the provision for emergency detention that was still on the books from the McCarran Act. And they succeeded in 1971 in getting that provision removed, so that at least on paper, you could no longer be detained and put in a camp for radicalism. Now, once again, if we're thinking about the trajectory from the Fugitive Slave Act to the McCarran Act to the USA Patriot Act, we know that that's continually reinvigorated, but we also know that it's continually opposed. So the state thinks about us all together, but we recognize each other to the extent that we can see one another, right? So as we mine through these histories, we come to realize that there are many points that bring, in this short story I just told you, Jewish Nazi hunter, the Black Panther Party, and the Asian American Political Alliance together in opposing the constant regime of surveillance. Yesterday, I went out to Ozone Park to talk to some of the contemporary members of the new Sanctuary Coalition here. And they're practicing, they've inaugurated a practice that I think is really instructive for our purposes today of accompaniment. And some of you may have seen the coverage of Ravi Ragbir's case. But what happens is when somebody has to visit immigration court for a check-in, when there's a fear that they'll be detained and then deported, they go with like 60 to 100 of their friends. And the Sanctuary Coalition is pretty careful about the friends that they send being native-born, citizen, clergy, and professionals. And what I heard yesterday was that when this happens, and when it happens over time, over the last 3 or 4 years, the court system shifts a little. So some of the incredible arsenal of dirty tricks that are performed when the foreign-born turn up for these hearings on their own are harder to do in public, right? It doesn't mean that, this is the end of detention, although that's the long-term aim of the Sanctuary Coalition. But it means that sometimes people who are about to be detained walk out free, right? Which builds our sense of what is possible and what the public is, and changes the conditions on the ground in terms of vulnerability. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me, Tina, BCRW, Avi. I'm always honored to be part of this group, part of attending what goes on at Barnard, and these conferences are so important and so wonderful. So thank you. So let me begin with just talking about some of the issues that I've studied over the last 10 to 15 years, thinking about what I call the security state. So I'm arguing, along with many others, that what's happened now is that the US and many other countries around the world have, under the kind of neoliberal financialization policies and the rise of a certain kind of neoliberal capital, become turned into security states. They do not even claim to be any more welfare states. And that massive shift has changed the ways in which states relate to each other, the way they relate to us as citizens, and the way they relate to particularly corporations. So I'm going to talk about all of these together now, right? So 3 decades of neoliberalism and more, if you begin with thinking about structural adjustment policies that came out after the debt crisis in the 1970s, have changed the state, as I said. But, you know, and I'm not going to talk about these protest movements, but what I see also in response to these is protest movements that are emerging all over the world, everywhere. They're not synchronous. They may not be articulating the same kind of project. They don't use the same language, but they are rising up in all kinds of ways against this kind of security state. So I want to just think about non-synchronous kinds of protests and movements that happen all over the world, right? So in the US, the neoliberal project has shifted to what I call an advanced stage because it's produced a lot of crisis. And the crisis that it has produced is the waning of US power in the world, but at the same time, the continued use of militarism, right? So the military power is there, but the kinds of ways in which the soft power of the US emerge all over the world has been really on the waning side. So this is really important, and I trace in my book, I trace it to the ways in which the visibility of what happened after Katrina was transmitted globally all over the world through news media and what it did to the image of the US. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of subjects that I see who are being produced out of this neoliberal security state that I've been talking about. And I see 2 kinds of key ways in which this state functions, right? It functions through projects of surveillance and securitization. That means that forms what we thought was criminalization and policing are increasingly militarized, right? And more people are being included as threats to the state, to the existence of the nation state as well. There were always people who were concerned, but it's expanding who can become the threat to the nation state, right? And the second way in which I see this as an important factor is that what we see is the new technologies that have emerged incorporate all of us in the process of surveillance, right? And they might be the most benign uses. I want to check on my friend who might be in the neighborhood, right? I'm looking for a partner. I'm checking on my child. I'm looking at all of these things. All of these things include us in the project of surveillance. So the new technologies that are coming into existence now are incorporating all of us as people who can surveil, right? And this is a key aspect of thinking about how the state, the security state, becomes governmentalized. And it's something that one has to think about and resist in a conscious and careful way all the time. When I look at the ways in which I think about the security state is the kinds of subjects who are being produced. One, sort of the parent who will surveil their family, the mother or father who feels anxious for their child and wants to surveil them. The ways in which and this is pertinent to what just happened, the emergence of a particular sort of sovereignty that is dispersed to white men. And you can see this in the Second Amendment interpretations, in the gun laws, that a particular group of people are seen to be sovereign subjects and no one else is, right? They have the power to kill, And that power is dispersed from the state to these particular kinds of subjects. Hence, the kind of foot dragging of the state around the gun laws, because what the state does is give people the power to kill, that the state is supposed to have to itself, it then endows upon a particular group of people, right? So the several points before I will talk about one key example about surveillance regimes in the present, but just to think about these points that I want to throw out. Surveillance is governmentalized as securitization. It's there to make us feel more secure. I feel better if I know that there's a camera on my caregiver who's looking after my child, right? It's there to produce this affective notion of feeling secure, feeling that I can watch over my child, right? This is kind of what we are seeing now in these surveillance regimes. So the security state builds on prior histories of empire and racialized surveillance, which are embedded in new technologies, and the previous panels also mentioned this, within algorithms, predictive analytics that they're called, that are produced out of the vast amounts of data already existing, which are already racialized, right? They're gendered, they're racialized, they're caste in India. So all of these that create new racialized profiles. These are profiles that are being produced. And these build on the colonial state's history of biometric identification and information gathering. And I think of the production of the fingerprint as a mode of power in colonial India, of Bertillon's kind of use of biometrics in France. All of these have longer histories that are really important to think of, histories of empire. And many of the ways, and I've talked about this, our personal relationships are being produced as relations enabled and mediated by surveillance, which I think is the most powerful way in which we are interpolated into the surveillance state. The surveillance regimes have a political economy that produces and consumes information as commodities. So every time we go online, we produce a commodity for corporations who can buy and sell this information, right? And this is not just because, the US, as we know, is a chief manufacturer of weapons that all over the world. But now we have technology companies who are participating in these forms of corporate surveillance. So the government has a very weak response to how the government gathers information from us. It has not been completely ineffective in doing so. In fact, it uses corporations to gather information about us. And this collaboration between state and corporations is key to the power of the security state. Finally, we need to think about the kind of role of technology. Technology, I don't want to argue, is determining, but technology has embedded in it particular histories of power, right? And it does what we ask them to do, or ask it to do. Technology instrumentalizes, praise, and commodifies the kinds of fears that are being produced every day by the security state. So this kind of important way in which what some see as corporate sovereignty is really critical. So I want to think about all of these various ways in which the security state functions. And I'll give you a quick case study of it in the remaining time that I have. In the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombings, Reddit user Chris Reyes created a thread to crowdsource information about the perpetrators of the bombing and enable the community of Redditors to provide online and real-time breaking news about the event. As an image of the bomber surfaced, another Reddit user claimed to have found a match in the photograph of a missing teenager. It was a South Asian, Sunil Tripathi. He was a college student who had been missing, whose parents were circulating his image on social media to locate him. As the New York Times later reported, abusive and angry threats and messages began to appear on the Facebook page that had been set up to find him. His family called the FBI, which told them that Sunil was not a suspect in the bombing, and the family removed the Facebook page, fearing that if he saw the abusive messages, that he would harm himself. These messages were also circulated by so-called reputable journalists, such as Luke Russert, on sites such as BuzzFeed, across Twitter. Slate article reported that even a New York Times reporter helped circulate the information, as did Politico. Right. In another similar case at that time, two young Moroccan students, one who was 17, were wrongly identified by the New York Post as suspects, and their images placed on the cover of the newspaper, suggesting they were suspects. These two students had gone to watch the marathon but had left before the bombing happened. It's not clear how the Post found their photograph, why it placed it on the cover with the caption, "Bag Men," though it was obvious that racial profiling played a role. Redditors circulated the Moroccan students' images as possible suspects. Ultimately, as the second bomber was identified, right, there was much soul-searching on Reddit and other social media networks. And Reddit's general manager, Eric Martin, apologized to Sunil Tripathi's parents. The Redditor who had started the thread quit the site in April 2013, protesting it was not the threat of lawsuits that made him close the site, and stating that users should consider Reddit a place for rumors rather than news. At the same time, Reddit received a huge publicity boost with massive increases in traffic to the social network. According to the Pew Research Center, 6% of online adults are Reddit users, with young white males as especially likely to use the network. It's known for being quote-unquote content agnostic, that's its claim, and for embracing all kinds of tendencies, libertarian, anarchic, conservative, all of those. Reddit's general manager, Eric Martin, saw the Sunil Tripathi incident as a natural outcome of social media. As he told the New York Times, the loss of personal privacy is an inherent issue to the internet as a whole. If you go out in public, you should expect that your photo is going to be taken somewhere by either the traffic cameras on the street or by some creepy-ass guy who takes your photo when you're not looking. Twitter has a creep factor. Facebook has a creep factor. But nobody ever talks about that. They only talk about those things when they show up on Reddit. In reality, it's everywhere. Actually, we do talk about that, but we get trolled and doxxed if we do. His colleague Alex Angel added, quote, "I just don't understand why the blame was put on us and not on the outlets that did shoddy reporting. Reddit is just a bunch of normal people who are basically chattering. Major news sources put out the bad information without any verification, but we got the blame." In sum, neither Reddit nor the news media outlet, the print media outlets, took responsibility for the circulation of this wrong information, right? Redditors use blurry images to become armchair detectives, circulating information that casts suspicion on young South Asian, Middle Eastern young men as terrorists. While many Redditors hide their identities online, there is little popular interest in keeping others' identities private. As much as Reddit's powerful owners claim that privacy should not be expected in the internet age, the network itself allows pseudonyms and anonymous postings. Its ability to make information viral is dangerous, especially since widespread social ideologies tend to circulate rapidly. And Reddit is known for having some very nasty subreddits, and nasty is a euphemism. Thus, it was not surprised that in a New York Times interview, Sunil's sister thoughtfully told the reporter, quote, "One thing we've been struck by is how porous the space is between social media, the media, and law enforcement. Such porosity means that users of Reddit and other media networks have greater power to circulate their ideas, ensuring that these powerful groups become even more powerful." In a perceptive essay on how gender gets encoded into websites, Erin Marr writes that while Reddit's voting algorithm itself may not discriminate, other aspects of the site's infrastructure and the way users interact with it and each other allow many opportunities for prejudice to impact a user's experience. Reddit's notion of popularity and anonymity, she points out, has two problems. It allows the posts and wills of a few so-called admins to masquerade as the will of many users, right? Second, because the site precludes any possibility of identification, the user then becomes, she says, by default, quote, "a white, straight, cisgender man," unquote, relegating to the margins all those who don't identify as such. Along with this default identity comes racist, sexist, just the most awful racist stuff, which are very popular on the site. Maha writes that the Sunil Tripathi Reddit post showed the site is unable to separate truth from fiction, a point evident in subsequent news, but that this fiction, because of the power of these, Reddit, for instance, becomes news, becomes racial profiling, incorporates itself through racial profiling. Sunil Tripathi, Trayvon Martin, and other youth of color often are constructed as dangerous because of their race, gender, or ethnicity, has placed them outside normative masculine citizenship. The dubious link between South Asian or Moroccan suspects and the Boston bombing was made on a social network in which a group of mostly white men, judging by the majority of Redditors who circulate the thread and sent it to the FBI, collectively took on the task of police, surveilling the web for a match, helping the police not just with tips, as they are called, as we are asked to turn in all the time, but by becoming detective vigilantes themselves. In addition, there was little accountability for the harassment of the family itself of the young Sunil Tripathi, though the families of the two Moroccan men filed defamation suits against it. Reddit's platform empowered already powerful communities to police the web, right? Circulating racialized notions of Muslim men, South Asian, as terrorists, and revealing a collaboration between private corporations, media, and police. The remark that his sister, Sangeeta Tripathi, Sunil Tripathi's sister, makes about porosity signals the concern about loss of privacy, liberal or neoliberal, leading those who are non-white and non-Christian to fear such circulating power, as well as the aggrandizement of powerful collaborations. In this context, it's important to know not only the corporate commodities being created, but also the parameters of the data being collected and the profiles that are being sought through these technologies, right? All parents and families are made to experience insecurity, and this is a deliberate project, though for very different reasons and with very different concerns and scales. The insecurities of white middle-class parents come not from the police, the state, or racialized subordination, from a belief that new technologies make their children into victims of predators or into digital natives, as they are called, who threaten the patriarchal authority. Family sovereignty then becomes of stake, as well as white middle-class's parents' authority to keep the family private. For non-white parents, and the panel before made this point, privacy has never been a right that they could fight for. Ultimately, privacy itself becomes a project of racialized power as well as a source of insecurity. So the trade between security and privacy is a dubious proposition. The duality itself needs to be questioned. The implication of individual agency in giving up privacy for security then misrecognizes the sovereignty of citizenship for the sovereignty of corporations and the security state in the collaborations and tensions of empire under advanced neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone involved in organizing this for inviting me to speak. So what I thought I'd do in the time I have is just to share with you 4 general points, claims, questions on the study of surveillance that I've been thinking about in my own research recently, and which hopefully will be of use to those of you also thinking about how movements should respond to surveillance, right? So the first question, the first kind of theme that I want to think about is the question of what we could call methodological nationalism in the study of surveillance, right? So in my last book, I was concerned with researching how FBI agents think about the counterterrorism surveillance of Muslim populations within the United States. Okay, so I interviewed a number of FBI agents in different parts of the United States. And what you find is quite quickly that around a third of those agents doing that kind of counterterrorism work come from military backgrounds in which they've been involved in counterinsurgency campaigns in the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. And they understood their work within the US as essentially a continuation of that work outside the United States, right? So when you talk about counterinsurgency, what it means to them at least is divide up a population that you consider to be a target population, divide that population up into friends and enemies, right? Into the extremists and the moderates, whatever the vocabulary you want to use, and isolate the extremists from the moderates, win over the moderates to your side, hearts and minds, all that kind of vocabulary that we see, right? So what's interesting is that the FBI agents talk about doing exactly the same stuff in Texas and Minnesota, right? They talk in exactly the same ways about tribal leaders that are they on our side or are they part of the problem, right? Talking, in relation to this context here. And when you're in the control room of the counterterrorism teams within FBI field offices, you'll see a row of clocks on the wall, all the different time zones in the United States, and then another clock for the time zone in Iraq, and another one for the time zone in Afghanistan. So it gives you a sense of the kind of mental geography that they have going on, which is the war on terror mental geography, right? This kind of seamless operational space stretching from Kabul to California, right? So even though it's meant to be, obviously the point is, even though it's meant to be a domestic law enforcement agency, it imagines itself doing something that has a global footprint through the war on terror, right? You see the same with the New York Police Department, which has agencies all around the world, which imported its surveillance of Muslim populations from Israel's occupation of the Palestinian West Bank. This is the surveillance program that figures that if you are Muslim living in this part of the world and you give up smoking, that's an indicator of radicalization. So if you're Muslim in this city, keep smoking. It's much healthier. Keep smoking. It's the surveillance program that had so many undercover agents visiting South Asian and Arab restaurants in the city that we figured that it was basically a kind of government subsidy for the restaurant sector. Right, so we make these jokes, right, about surveillance because it's a way of processing that anxiety, right? You always get this. Listen to anyone who was living under the Stasi in East Germany. They talk a lot about the jokes as a kind of way of dealing with that normalized surveillance, right? So I think we can't understand policing and surveillance unless we see it in this kind of globally integrated infrastructure, right, that ties together kind of multiple military networks, multiple commercial surveillance networks for databases that media corporations gather, the surveillance from military drones, the databases that are produced by Homeland Security profiling at airports, the interrogation of prisoners at detention centers around the world. It blurs all these boundaries, right, between state and industry, between military and civilian policing, between external and internal security, overlaps between the security that's framed as part of counterterrorism, national security, with the surveillance that's part of mass incarceration, with the surveillance that's part of racialized deportation, and so on, right? So, the picture is one in which the empire comes home, right? Whether it's the staff who work in the empire coming home to work domestically, whether it's the technologies, whether it's the concepts, but also the empire projecting from, the home projecting out into the empire, right? If you think about the Chicago Police Department's officer who, Richard Zuley, right, who was involved in torture and interrogations in Chicago's police department, who then repeats the same stuff at Guantanamo, right? So we continuously see this kind of back and forth movement, right? And that we see that not just recently, but going all the way through the history of surveillance in the United States, right? Alfred McCoy's work on the origins of the kind of mid-20th century national security state in the US colonial project in the Philippines, I think is very illustrative here. Continuously see these initiatives and practices and ideologies of surveillance that emerge in context overseas, come back home, and vice versa, right? So if we limit ourselves to national frames, not only will we be unable to account for how surveillance actually works, but we're also neuter the potential for internationalism in our movements, right? Which is more important than whether we're intellectually accurate. So that's the first point on the kind of nation frame. Second point, we need to study what states fail to see, okay? So currently, I'm working on a project looking at the work of H. Rap Brown, one of the, a number of things, but amongst other things, the chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from spring 1967, and the surveillance that various government agencies conducted of him, right? So in the LBJ library in Austin, you have all the papers of the Kerner Commission. You can go in there and you have, ream after ream of government surveillance files of H. Rap Brown from 1967 and 1968. So at that time, the White House is getting basically a daily report on what H. Rap Brown is up to that day from the FBI, right, throughout that year or so. And you can even have listen to a tape recording of Johnson and Hoover discussing what they should do with H. Rap Brown. And he's one of the 4 named individuals in the famous memo that J. Edgar Hoover writes in August 1967, the COINTELPRO memo, which talks about exposing, disrupting, misdirecting, discrediting, or otherwise neutralizing so-called black nationalist hate groups, right? So that material's all there. And then alongside that, we can put, so that gives you a sense of what the state sees or what the state thinks it sees, right? What we can also do then is look at the Snick Archives in the King Center, Atlanta. We can interview veterans of Snick. We can communicate a little with H. Rap Brown, or Jamil Alameen, which is his current name. He's in a federal prison in Arizona, so it's a 15-minute phone call occasionally. It's letters. I'm not allowed to interview him in person. But for all of that material and for all the scholarship that's been done on Snick now, which is reasonably extensive, we can also get an account of what Snick thinks they're doing, what H. Rap Brown would have thought he was doing, right? So we can ask, what does the state see and what does it fail to see, right? So first, the extent of the surveillance is impressive, right, from one perspective, right? Every public word spoken is recorded, right? Every trip taken is recorded. His family history is documented, his associates, his multiple aliases, right? There's one agent in the Atlanta field office of the FBI called Edward Krim, whose whole job is basically keeping track of H. Rap Brown and producing endless reports, detailed studies, biographical sketches. Some of it would be, not out of place in a third-rate novel, right? And it's already international, right? So you also have the Anti-Defamation League taking an interest on behalf of Israel in what Rap Brown's up to from the summer of 1967 because of the position Snick has taken in supporting Palestinian liberation around the context of the 67 occupation, right? So and there's the interchange with the liberation movements in Africa, in Latin America, and the Caribbean that Snick is involved in, which is all being tracked as well, right? So it's already international. But what's striking is that in spite of all the material that the government has, right, they completely misread who Brown is and what he stands for, right? They are convinced that Snick is a communist front, that H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael are controlled by communists, and that the uprisings that are taking place in the summer of 1967 are being instigated by Snick as a communist front organization as part of essentially a kind of communist plot to destabilize America, right? Now, that's not propaganda for the benefit of the public. That's what they think is going on in their own private discussions, right? So this ignorance is not just a matter of bad intelligence gathering, but it's structural to how the state sees the world, I want to argue, right? There is fantasy, there is displacement. These distortions are inherent to the state gaze. And I think the importance of this is that we have a tendency, when we talk about surveillance, we tend to credit the state with omniscience, right? The state is not a god, all right? And we're not very good about talking how states are structurally ignorant, right? Which, of course, means that it's politically self-defeating, right? Because we exaggerate how powerful the state is over us, in spite of, obviously, all the stuff that the state can do to us, right? So if you look at older studies of surveillance, they don't make this mistake, right? So, a text that should be a classic in surveillance studies but very rarely gets mentioned is Victor Serge's 1926 book, Corridors of the Security Police. So Victor Serge, if you don't know him, was a Russian revolutionary who, after the 1917 revolution in Russia, spends time in the archives that have been gathered by the Okhrana, which is the Tsarist secret police, and which the Bolsheviks have captured, right? So they have this opportunity to study how they've been surveilled by what is actually the most advanced surveillance system in the world at that time, right? I mean, the Okhrana they have files on 500,000 Russians. They have 35,000 informants in Russia. They have code crackers that can break any code. They organize their filing system, which is all paper-based, obviously, in a way that looks very much like what today would be considered advanced social network analysis software, right? Mapping relationships, right? Nothing is new in surveillance if you look at what they did. It's just made faster through digital technologies, right? So, they study this, right? Victor Serge studies this system, finds out exactly what they were saying, what they thought they could see about everything, right? And what he says is they have a very high level of accuracy about individuals and organizations. The police had to see everything, know, understand, and have power over everything, but nonetheless, they were powerless to prevent what happened. It would in fact be wrong to let oneself be taken in by the apparently perfect mechanism of Tsarist security, right? So they can watch very effectively, but they don't know what they're watching, because what they're watching is their own demise, okay? This brings us to the third point. So we need to engage in the deep and intricate knowledge of surveillance that resides in communities, right? So in part of this research I'm doing on H. Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Amin's activism and the surveillance of him and the movement he was part of, I've been interested in thinking about how these movements navigated the terrain of surveillance, right? Were they aware of the extent of it? What strategies and tactics did they adopt in response, right? So the person who has helped me think about this is someone called Karima Al-Amin, who's been Jamil Al-Amin's partner since the summer of 1967 and until 1971 was Lynn Doswell. Now, Lynn Doswell, as she was known at the time, was central to figuring out how to enable H. Rap Brown to function underground for 18 months from March 1970, right? So some of the techniques that her and her parents, who were also involved in this, developed were things like signaling systems with janitors and supervisors working in their building where they live, so they could have a kind of warning system for when people who seemed like government or police agents arrived in the building. Her and her parents regularly having to lose cars that are following them, right? They're traveling in ways that enable them to travel in a hidden way by figuring out how you and other people in your family can buy tickets to different places and kind of seduce the government into thinking you're going to one place when really you're going to another under a different name. That's how she manages to travel to Tanzania without the government knowing, to visit Snick activists who are there. And you can look at the CIA files, which are also available in the archives, and see that CIA, sending messages to all their offices around the world trying to track down H. Rap Brown in 1970, 1971. They have no idea where he is. Every field office is sending back these photos of people they think is H. Rap Brown in Hong Kong, in Algiers, in the Caribbean, and none of them have got him. So they developed their own collection of names and photographs of FBI agents who are working on the case, right? So they're surveilling back against the FBI, right? So Ashley Farmer says of this moment in her work on this same theme, black women activists banded together to combat the Bureau's dogged pursuit of their families. They created networks to help care for children, fought intelligence gathering, and provide financial support when they and their families lost their jobs and homes, and when their children were expelled from school. These networks also functioned as the organizers' own forms of intelligence. They shared information, conferred with one another about how to strategize in legal cases against the Bureau, and discussed their personal struggles of surviving state oppression. So Lynn Doswell's family, her and her parents, were using all these kind of fairly sophisticated techniques, right? Some of this stuff is, spy film stuff, right? So where did this knowledge come from? How did they get these techniques? Well, when you ask Karima Al-Amin, she says, we learned it through the family stories we heard growing up, okay? Every previous generation in her family had to do similar stuff. Going back to the Dred Scott Supreme Court case in which her ancestors were involved and then had to flee to Canada to escape from the Klan. They needed to know how to hide, right? I think what's significant here is that the problem of dealing with surveillance is not being seen in this account as a kind of technical problem or a specialist problem that you can kind of go and get training for from some kind of NGO, right? The skills are not imparted through those kinds of specialists, but as if the issue is how can you protect your individual privacy in this kind of activist world. The framing is very different. It's about intergenerational storytelling. It's about preserving histories of struggle from generation to generation, right? And at no point does the question of who are the legitimate targets of surveillance come up. That's just not part of the discourse, right? So the liberal notion of privacy is just not deployed here at all. The question is not really how to protect privacy, but how do we ensure that we know more about them than they know about us, right? So it's not about ending surveillance, but about us out-surveilling them, right? And so the fourth point, right? We need to reflect more deeply on how our study of surveillance relates to movements for liberation, I think. So in February 2014, Judge William Martini of the US District Court in Newark dismissed the civil rights lawsuit brought by 8 Muslims who said that the NYPD surveillance programs were unconstitutional, right? And the judge's argument is basically this. The plaintiffs claim that they've been harmed by police surveillance because being under surveillance means that they feel less able to express their religious and political identities. But the plaintiffs didn't know they were under surveillance until journalists at the Associated Press published stories about this secret surveillance program based on leaked documents. So the judge says, quote, plaintiffs' alleged injuries flow from the Associated Press's unauthorized disclosure of the documents. Thus, the injury, if any existed, is not fairly traceable to the city, i.e. the police, right? So, obviously, from the point of view of trying to assert a civil rights argument in the courts against surveillance, this is kind of a really dangerous argument because it means that what the court is saying is surveillance is fine, it's the journalism about surveillance that's the problem, right? But from a broader point of view, actually, there's something in the judge's argument that can't just be kind of too quickly dismissed here. There's a real dilemma to do with the stories we tell about surveillance and the effect of those stories on our movements, right? So roughly, we can say that there are 2 kinds of effects that surveillance can have on movements, right? I want to suggest. So the first one is the one that we've already referred to. In a conflict between a movement and the security state, part of the conflict is to do with who knows more about the operations of the other, right? But there's another effect, which is the way that surveillance fosters what Victor Serge calls the evil of suspicion and distrust, okay? So here the conflict is not so much about knowledge as about, on the one hand, the movement's capacity to build community, loyalty, and love, and on the other hand, the capacity of surveillance to break us down into fearful, lonely individuals, each of us only relating to the other through the kind of panoptic gaze of the state and the kind of market surveillance that Inderpal Grewal was just talking about, right? So in this sense, there's a kind of an alignment between neoliberal capitalism and panoptic surveillance, which I think Foucault was onto in his lectures on the birth of biopolitics in 1978 and 79. What is relevant here is, so, you know, when we talk about neoliberalism, what we don't talk about enough is what neoliberalism does to the soul, right? And I you know, academics like to talk about the body, and it's weird to talk about the soul, but I don't think there's another word that can kind of be used here. And I realize I'm saying soul, having earlier talked about God. Don't worry, I'm not going to get religious. But the point is, what does neoliberalism do to the soul, right? And what does surveillance do to the soul? How does it have that kind of sense of turning us all into competitors with each other, of individualizing us, of breaking down the collectivities that come from social struggles, right? To me, that's what neoliberalism fundamentally tries to do, to use the logic of the market to break up social struggles, right? And surveillance is integral to that project because contrary to the myth of neoliberalism, the neoliberal state does not withdraw from the economy, but plays a constant role of supervision to enforce what it imagines to be the logic of the market, right? So here's the point. A study of surveillance that simply catalogues what state and market systems do to us is necessary but insufficient, right? Because if we just do that and nothing else, we end up reinforcing the image of the state as omniscient. We foster the very isolation and fearfulness that we need to overcome. We do the state's work for it, right? The state wants us to think it's constantly seeing what we're up to, right? And so we need to get out of this kind of individualist frame of thinking about surveillance, the frame that thinks that the answer is to talk about a kind of liberal notion of privacy. We need, you know, the kind of knowledge of surveillance that we need is the knowledge that includes those stories of community struggle and survival, the things that neoliberalism and its surveillance cannot see and cannot measure but nevertheless seeks to destroy, right? So the antagonism of surveillance is not privacy, but the making of communities in a struggle, right? And so here, the way that I think a nice way of capturing this is to quote A. Sivanandan, who was the founder, editor of the journal Race and Class, who died last month. And he talks about the values and traditions that have come down to us from the working class movement: loyalty, comradeship, generosity, a sense of community, and a feel for internationalism, an understanding that unity has to be forged and reforged again and again, and above all, a capacity for making other people's fights our own. All the great and simple things that make us human. Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here and share the panel with such amazing scholars, and to be sharing this conference with all of the other panelists in the other panels. My name is Marlene Nava Ramos, and I thought I would give a very brief and short presentation, mostly about my research. And I have a lot of holes in here, so I hope that you all ask during the Q&A. And before I begin, I want to thank my friends and family for coming. I know that it's hard to get up early in the morning on a Saturday, so I really appreciate you being here from the beginning. So we live in a moment of crises of authority where the reach of the US immigration enforcement system has become notably and truly breathtaking. In the last 3.5 decades, the US government has deported 6 million people. Yet rather than exclusively expanding the powers of the federal government, we know that contemporary immigration enforcement relies on a highly comprehensive yet decentralized network of local jurisdictions which have long dispersed, albeit unevenly, enforcement operations from the borderlands to the interior. Whether or not any one of these local jurisdictions is involved in the entire process from beginning to end, they collectively form one of the most far-reaching systems that targets, relabels, polices, raids, supervises, imprisons, and permanently banishes people who've migrated from one part of the world to another and forces them back again. Collectively, these state agencies succeed in continuously expanding the legal categories of who's an excludable person, and therefore who's a deportable person, even whether or not the violation had anything to do with immigration. Geographer Ruthie Gilmore inspires my work, and for this talk, I'd like to briefly think about the ways, or consider the ways in which immigration enforcement, one, is embedded in the crises and restructurings of racial capitalism, imbricated in the conjunctures that give rise to the largest imprisonment projects in recent history, and 3, to reproduce and maintain such carceral infrastructure relevant under contemporary fragile and politically contested moments. By racial capitalism, I'm of course making reference to the late great Cedric Robinson, who poses that racial relations are the material foundation and mechanics of all forms of capitalism. So the focus in racial capitalism is less about the peoples whose lives are so keenly being destroyed, and more about the shifts in elasticity of racisms that are embedded in capitalist social relations. After all, racism against Mexicans, for example, long existed precisely for the productivity of their labor exploitation. In fact, the literature for a long time studied the dialectical relationship between restrictive laws on one hand and the opening of global human movements on the other as synergistically congruent with the US economy. State-sanctioned practices, whether legal, symbolic, or rhetorical, worked to place immigrants under precarious statuses, but did little to outright exclude them from the country. So if not immigration per se, what crises did immigrant policing and imprisonment purport to solve? While some specific research is still necessary, I'm not going to share it with you right now, we can turn to the empirical and timeless contributions of Ruthie Gilmore, who studies the times and places where interlocking crises of accumulation fail to produce the equal necessity to disaccumulate and threaten the entire system of social relations. Though historically immigration and the criminal legal system have evolved in their respective legal traditions, important turning points in or ruptures in the political economy of racial capitalism has made them into singular responses, or converted them into singular responses. Policing and imprisonment, as such, emerge as central configurations that fix crises into new social formations. For one, Florida, a state with the 5th largest disenfranchisement rate today, first turned towards systematically policing Cuban Marielitos and their Haitian counterparts at the height of what seems to be political, economic, and social crises in the early 1980s, or at least that's when I say it all began. Hundreds and thousands of immigrants arrived after a long decade of resistance to burgoying inequality. Reagan was running for his first presidential term, and although Congress had just passed the Refugee Act of 1980, the streets of Miami were especially restless as an all-white jury acquitted 4 police officers involved in the beating and death of 33-year-old African-American Arthur McDuffie. Under this backdrop, Marielitos were successfully constructed as Castro's undesirables in local and national headlines. Their Haitians fared worse as they were represented as deeply impoverished economic migrants who had high rates of HIV and tuberculosis, and as such, their plight didn't warrant refugee status, even though they had been under a dictator's rule for almost a decade. However, before there could possibly be a consensus around the issue, part of the once Nike Hercules missile site, a 22 facility base spread across the vast terrain of the Everglades and built at the height of the Cold War, was repurposed into what is now the infamous Chrome Detention Center. The repurposing of a one-time missile base into a detention center seems to signal what Gilmore calls military Keynesianism to post-Keynesian militarism. In short, the state's infrastructural and fiscal powers designed for war making against foreign enemies increasingly shifted for the policing, containment, and outright exclusion of domestic underclasses. So today, in places like New York and New Jersey, which are places that I study, which laud themselves for being immigrant-friendly jurisdictions, are actually responsible for sweeping thousands of immigrants into the criminal legal system. While much attention is given to federal agencies and their agents, it's actually local jurisdictions that occupy a much more central and willing role. Their law enforcement officers, their laws, their various district attorneys and courts, their municipal and county jails, their state prisons are all part of the system that facilitate the rebranding of an individual who, because of that, actually qualify for being a deportable person under US federal law. So in some cases, county jails such as the Hudson County Jail, which is right outside of New York City and New Jersey, as well as the Essex County Jail, the Bergen County Jail, the Monmouth County Jail, all in New Jersey, all eagerly volunteer to rent out their bed space to federal authorities and agree to house people in deportation proceedings, which is only the very tail end of immigration enforcement. Like state and federal facilities, municipal and county jails often exist in places of underdevelopment, which once belonged to the productive manufacturing and agricultural sectors of the economy. These jurisdictions, at least in New York and in New Jersey, agreed to fill up their bed space while their overall prison rates level off. As such, immigration enforcement creates a reproductive relationship with federal and local jurisdictions and existing infrastructure. And deportation itself and a disposable, not just an exploitable labor force, maintain a reproductive relationship in racial capitalism that help to put to work, as Dr. Gilmore often says, that help to put to work existing infrastructure and keep it relevant and in use in the face of potential insecurity and crises of the state. However, as a space of struggle, which I think we're in right now, it is important to remember that this moment of crises of authority, and when I say authority, I hope you have an image in your head, the general crises of the state is actually a moment of opportunity, where one must push harder against the president's vulgar and outlandish forms of racism and beyond the benchmarks that were already in place when he took office. There's a sense of obligation to stand against the current administration, but more specifically against the local jurisdictions and their mayors and their superficial reforms. Thank you.
We ran late, so I'm told we actually have to end, so there are performers who are planning to do a performance and need to leave. So we need to close up. Let me just take a couple seconds to plant some thoughts and reactions of my own, and then hopefully we'll have a little time to continue discussion as we break. So we've been hearing and thinking about the state, and on the panel today we've been thinking about militarism and war. And I think the papers, the presentations in this panel have also put onto the table the relationship between state and capital. And when we're thinking about borders, we take this back to the Fugitive Slave Laws. There's another series of laws in the United States, the Trade and Intercourse Acts, which govern the relationship between the U.S. government and tribal nations that were renewed over the same period of time. So we have war and finance, the interrelations of state and capital that are produced in a long history through relations of surveillance. And this happens through landed relationships. Dr. Gilmore spoke in the earlier panel about relationships to place and landed relationships. And this is a mechanism of power, but I think it's also a mechanism of subversion, the production making communities through struggle. So I'll leave you with a story from Harriet Tubman, who's always in my mind as well. I believe it was 1853 in Troy, New York. A black man named Charles Now was apprehended and was about to be deported into slavery in the South. A group of black people gathered in the courthouse and in front of the courthouse to try to prevent this. And Harriet Tubman was passing through the town, broke into the courthouse, and grabbed Charles Now's waist and did not let go. She was beaten severely by the police, but they failed to dislodge her from his body. He was able to jump out the window and was safely escorted off a boat and was able to flee the police power. And this comes to mind with the story that you reported, Rachel, about the current tactic of showing up in the court. So these are deep histories, these are deep knowledges in our communities that we have. So this is always in my mind, and I wanted to leave you with that. So let's break.